All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Millennials Are Old podcast. And you know what, Brian? I think we can say in the year 2023 that punk is not dead. It is clearly an extremely relevant genre, just like it's always been.
Oh yeah, there's tons of great rock bands that people are paying attention to.
Yes, very much so. Guitar-driven music is all the fucking rage.
The Zoomers love it. They're all spiking their hair. They're listening to Gigi Allen.
Yeah, I mean, the most popular guitar-driven band right now is that 1 Million Gex band. You know, the one that very famously uses stringed instruments.
Some people might laugh about calling 100 Gex, 1000 Gex punk, but really, man, you ever think about this? Punk is a state of mind. So by doing a thing that sucks shit and that everyone hates, that's actually the most punk you could possibly be. They, them, 14-year-olds, like that are speeding up their voices so they sound like chipmunks, they're basically like Henry Rollins.
No, exactly. And you know what? Speaking of music that everybody universally loves, let's get into our album for this week, which is the album Arise by the band Amoebics. Now, Brian, this was your choice for this week's episode. Why'd you want us to review Arise by Amoebics?
Few things. So I've been listening to a lot of second wave kind of British punk. That is to say stuff after 77, kind of more splinter group stuff, a lot of oi, kind of skinhead music, mod revival stuff, UK 82, which is basically like the British equivalent to hardcore, and then like anarcho punk. So I've been listening to a lot of that, and the anarcho stuff in general, I've been pretty interested in because there's sort of two ways that UK punk developed after 77. Your artsier sort of things, Joy Divisions, your Wires, what have you. Or like way more aggro and way more street oriented and way more purist. That would be your Exploited, your Angelic Upstarts, your UK subs. What's interesting to me about the anarcho punk scene is that that's kind of where those two things intersect. And then listening to all that stuff, I eventually got to re-listening to this album, Arise by Amoebics. This has never been my favorite Amoebics album, but it's their most popular and it's their most influential. And I started listening to it just as I'm over in Oregon. Just as we started moving from summer into fall, it started getting cold and rainy and the clouds started to roll in. And I was starting to think about, because this album doesn't sound like any other punk rock. It's very bass driven, lots of harmonics, but it's very heavy, which punk up until probably the early 90s, I would not call most of it heavy. Most of the bands influenced by this, and it is extremely influential album, are like extreme metal bands, which we'll get into a bit later. And then it's just a very bleak album. It's an album about extreme economic depression, basically feelings of like decay and, stagnance. And I was thinking a lot about how this album is coming out of Thatcherist England and it's tied to there, but it sort of was alone in its time. And I think looking back at it now, you see a lot of things that came out in the 90s and 2000s very heavily indebted to it.
Yes. And you know what, Brian, before we get too much into my thoughts, because I actually have a lot more to say about this album than I thought it did on first listen. Let's get into some details here. So you mentioned this is an 80s album. This came out in 1985. It does not have a parental advisory sticker that I could find, but there's really not a whole lot of swearing on this album anyways, but that's not here nor there. It was once again performed by the band Amoebics. The personnel includes the vocalist and bassist Baron Rockin' von Aphib, Rob Miller, who we will certainly talk about a lot at the end of this episode, the guitarist and backing vocals Stig de Pig, which is the pseudonym of Chris Miller. The keyboardist is George Fletcher, and Spider plays the drums, which I thought was an interesting choice because I actually didn't remember a whole lot of keyboards on this album, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe I just wasn't paying attention.
That's actually one of the important things about Amoebics is the addition of like being very synth heavy. And most of it isn't like Depeche Mode synths, obviously. It's these kind of atonal, what we would now call industrial synthesizers.
That's probably what I was thinking of, yeah. This album was released on Alternative Records, which I believe, Brian, is that Jello Biafra's record label?
It is. Jello actually specifically reached out to Amoebics, said he would like to put out a record by them. This is actually their third release. I have heard that at the time that he put it out, he agreed to release it, that Jello actually was not crazy about this album. I don't know if that's because he personally wasn't as interested in the music, or one of my thoughts is that maybe he felt like it wasn't as marketable as he expected. His Alternative Tentacles did make money in the 80s, which is a little unusual for a punk label. And this is an album that there isn't a huge audience for this in punk at the time. It just sounded so different from, I think, what was going on in 85 in most punk.
No, for sure. Absolutely. I would say that this album has a lot more in common with like Venom and early Sepultura than it does like early 80s hardcore punk.
Oh, yeah.
And we'll definitely get
Yeah.
into some things that I think this album really, really reminds me of. And I think, Brian, you'll very much agree with me once we get to the track listing. And then speaking of, this album was produced by Jason Rosenberg, and the album is 38 minutes and 20 seconds long. So pretty good length, although very long for a punk album in 1985.
Most of the tracks are 4 to 5 minutes. Pretty long songs for a punk band also.
Very much so, yeah. A long punk song was maybe about 2.5, 3 minutes long.
So the thing with the anarcho scene in the UK is that in general, there's a lot of avant-garde tendencies there. It's all centered around Crass, who put out the first ever release by Amebix. But in general, like the anarchist punk scene, while it's harder edged and kind of in some ways maybe closer to what we in the States called hardcore than the Sex Pistols or something, it's also really weird. You know, it's got a lot of that post-punk kind of thing. Like Crass, for instance, had a lot of jazz influences. Amebix never quite go there. It's interesting to me how slow these songs are. They're like funeral dirges at their fastest.
I definitely know what you're talking about. And to be fair, there is one song that we'll get to in the track listing that I believe literally is a funeral dirge.
Oh, yeah.
So I was not able to find a production budget for this album, which makes sense. It's a fucking mid-80s punk album, so the production budget was a couple $100, I'm going to assume.
Probably, yeah.
And on Amazon, this album has a 4.6 out of 5, and on Rate Your Music, it has a 3.62 out of 5. On Amazon, it only has 7 reviews, which is the lowest I've ever seen for anything we've ever reviewed on Amazon. So the Amazon reviews, just spoilers ahead, are going to be rather succinct. I'll just say that. And then a little trivia. So the first trivia fact I have here is the song Largactyl was written in response and somewhat in honor to previous drummer Martin Baker for being diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and being institutionalized without choice by his parents. And before we get into the track listing too much, I do like most of the songs in this album, but Largactyl is definitely the song where I think this album just gets me just pumped the fuck up. That's like the first song that I really love on this album.
Agreed. There's no tracks on here that I don't like. I would say about half the album is like songs like Largactyl and some other ones that I think are like bangers. And then even the ones that aren't necessarily as like noteworthy as individual songs, I have such a distinct tone. But Largactyl's my favorite or second favorite track on this album for sure. Also, probably the most, in some ways, traditionally punk song. It's got a big chanty chorus and, you know, a big riff, which not all of the songs on here have.
No, very much so. So this album was recorded at SAM Studio in Bristol, England. This was their second LP and their third overall release. And the last trivia fact I have here, I was trying to find a lot of trivia without just going into the vocalist slash bassist politics, because we will definitely talk about that. So I wanted to find some relatively neutral trivia. But
politics? Would you say Amebix were maybe at one point associated with one type of politics? And then, I mean, it's not like, you know, Baron later on suddenly was associated with a different kind of politics.
Yes, he was originally a member of the British Liberal Party. So that was what I wanted to talk about later on. Not this part of the trivia, though. But yeah, so the last trivia fact I have here is such notable bands as Sepultura, Neurosis, and Deviated Instinct have paid homage to the band. In an interview with The Guardian in 2016, the band was cited along with a number of other British anarcho-punk bands of the early 80s as being an influence to the American avant-garde metal group Neurosis. Now, I do want to talk a little bit before we get to the track listing here. I noticed a lot of these songs. I think once we get to the track listing, I will... Okay, here we are. So the first song on this album is basically like an early Mayhem song. This is very early Mayhem. A lot of the later songs sound like black metal era Venom, and I definitely heard some influence on Sepultura as well. Like I could hear it very distinctly on this album.
Sepultura, big fans of this. I also believe Bathory were fans of Amebix. I assume, just based on some of the drum sounds, that this was an influence on early Mayhem, like you said. Neurosis, of course. There's important ones that I'm forgetting, but what you're probably taking away from this is that Amebix, even though they're coming distinctly from a punk background, and they were, like they weren't really playing with metal bands, other than Motorhead, who they played with. Their direct influence is mostly in like the extreme metal of the 90s. And, you know, early 2000s.
Yeah, and I also thought too, because this is, once again, an album came out in 1985, and this is like a heavy punk slash metal album. Like this is definitely an early representation of metal and punk colliding and creating like, you know, quasi crossover to a certain extent. Like it's kind of crazy to think about, because obviously, very famously in 1985, metal and punk subgenres did not interact at fucking all.
Or they would have
Very.
been just starting to. You'd be getting maybe your first, your suicidal tendencies would have been around a couple of years. They would have just been starting in the US to build those bridges.
Yeah, but it definitely was not a universal thing by any stretch of the imagination.
No. And then the other thing is that even if you put Amoebic next to the American crossover band, this is so different. Like those bands are playing fast and they're playing almost like party music where it's kind of like thrash metal with like a snotty sense of humor. And this is not like that. It's heavy and it's kind of slow for punk, but it's got like these at the time explicitly kind of leftist anarchist politics and this raw production and then this kind of like fucking descending bass. So even the punk and metal hybrids that existed, they weren't like this. This is like a bleak sounding kind of unrelenting band.
No, very much so. Absolutely. All right. So before we get into the track listing here, I usually save the Amazon reviews for last, but the Amazon reviews are very, very short. There were only 7 total reviews on Amazon once again. So I was able to find 3 reviews that had just enough content to make content here. So I'm just going to get these out of the way. So our first review here is from Lenin Orozco Torres, who gives this album 5 stars. Now, this original review was, I believe, in Spanish, so I translated it to English. The head of the review says, a true gem. And the body of the review says, the reissue of this classic is a true gem. The fathers of crust punk. Amoebics arise. So, you know what? Very short, sweet, and to the point.
Yeah, I mean, so the thing with crust punk, which is not my favorite punk subgenre, is called such because crust punks are often homeless, they don't work, they don't shower, they don't bathe, they eat expired food. This isn't a joke. But musically, most crust punk that comes after Amoebics is kind of like grindcore or DB. It's very thrashy and very aggro. Amoebics don't really have much in common, to me, musically with those bands. Ideologically, sure. You got the anarchist kind of freegan libertine thing. But musically, Amoebics' whole deal, I would say, is this kind of strange mix of 2 bands. So there's a very profound Motorhead influence, particularly on the Varen's vocals, and then just kind of on the kind of unhinged kind of blues bass. Like a lot of Amoebic songs do have a blues kind of riff to them. And then a lot of influence from the Killing Joke. Killing Joke are an early post-punk band who have these very trebly guitars, kind of bleep bloop robotic synthesizers, and a snarling vocalist who doesn't sound unlike the Baron Rob Miller. So Amoebics pretty early on kind of become a mesh of these 2 disparate bands to me musically, Killing Joke and Motorhead.
I could talk about Killing Joke all day. I fucking love Killing Joke. They're a great band.
Yeah, fucking great. Put out albums after albums, and most of the bands in their generation, after about 4 albums, they kind of tail off. Killing Joke, just everything they put out fucking slays. They still fucking kick ass. They're still great live. But I feel like Killing Joke, to me, are probably the biggest single influence on Amoebics, except for maybe Motorhead. I might say Motorhead were the bigger influence.
Well, you know what? Speaking of, Brian, I hear how much you love Killing Joke. Are you going to see them at, what's that new metal fest again?
I saw that they were on there. It's Sick New World.
Are you going to go to Sick New World to see Killing Joke?
There's some fucked up bands on there. And I don't mean fucked up like it's bands I love, but it's like Killing Joke and Swans. Swans are at Sick New World.
Yeah, it's really weird. I looked at some of the bands on there. Oh, Slow Dive are going to be there too.
Yeah, Slow Dive. It's like, this must be torture for those guys. I like new metal now. But like, I know that fucking Swans don't like playing with a bunch of new metal bands. I already know.
I mean, I've seen a couple of these bands at Summerfest in Milwaukee, so I'm totally fine skipping Sick New World. Also, Mr. Bungle are going to be there. It's like kind of all over the fucking place.
Yeah, that's too many bands in a day, dude. So my whole thing with festivals is that I don't want to see a band I love that I've never seen before for the first time at a festival. I don't want to see it for 20 minutes when they're jet lagged and rushed,
100%. Also, 1 million Gex are going to be there, so that's great.
Yeah, it's like, why? So I guess probably 1 million Gex or 1,000 Gex or whatever probably cite some new metal as an influence because of like their generation. That's possible. But Swans, like, I know they're just trying to kind of diversify the crowd they're bringing in. And it is like 90% new metal bands. Like, I shouldn't like nitpick too much. It's just weird to me that, Killing Joke and Swans will be there.
Yeah, Jesus fucking Christ. Can you imagine, Killing Joke getting off stage and be like, and your next band is going to be 1 million Gex?
It's such a bummer. Oh, so before I forget, since we're talking about influences and you brought up Venom, so a lot of people throughout Amebix's history have assumed, not without reason, that they were influenced by Venom. Baron Rob Miller hates Venom. He hates when people say that. And apparently he wrote a letter to Venom at one point telling them he thought they sucked and he couldn't stand them.
Oh, really?
And he hates Venom. Even though it's like, of course, people are going to think that there's so few bands that were heavy in this way at this time. Like, of course, people are going to assume that his band was influenced by Venom. But yeah, Amebix hate being compared to Venom, I guess.
Which is crazy because, like, I'm not going to say they're a one for one, but there's definitely some similarities here.
Yeah, agreed. So Black Sabbath, probably a big influence on Amebix. Almost seems so obvious, I almost didn't bother saying it, but probably, your other early post-punk bands, probably Bauhaus and Joy Division. But I'll stand by that. I think that the big reference points for Amebix are Killing Joke and Motorhead. I think basically you take those two bands and put them in a blender, you add some anarchist politics, you got Amebix.
No, I can definitely hear that. All right, so let's get to the next review here is from Love Legs, who gives this 5 stars. And the head of the review says, "The Axeman is coming." And the body of the review says, "What's not to love? This album is amazing. I've missed having it in my collection for far too long." So that's the end of that review. And before we get too much into that, let's get into our final review here. Now, this is possibly the most complex review I've ever done for the podcast. So just sit tight, Brian.
Before you get there, I want to say I have a theory for why the 2 reviews we've done so far are so brief. They were written by crust punks who had to type up their reviews at the public library. Yeah. They had a limited amount of time to use the computer.
Oh, Jesus fucking Christ. And then the librarian was like, "Okay, well, we usually give you an hour, but we're only going to give you 3 minutes because you smell like shit.
This chair after this kid leaves."
Yeah. Well, Brian, of course, as everybody knows, you live in Portland. You know about this more than fucking anybody else.
It would be so much less sad if you saw any crust punk kids, but it's all legit homeless people. I'd feel better if I saw some crust kids and you were like, "Oh, that's cool. You can choose to not work a little bit." Oh, another thing I've learned since moving here is even your crust punks at a certain age probably aren't homeless by choice. Like I've encountered a lot of crust punks with their amoebic patches and crass patches, but you gather pretty quickly. You're like, "Oh, you're kind of a crust punk. You're homeless by choice, but also not by choice."
Yeah, God. But speaking of things that aren't depressing, let's get into this extremely complex review, Brian. So just sit tight, hold on to your butts. Let's get into it. So Amazon customer gives us 5 stars, and the head of the review says 5 stars, and the body of the review says great. And that's it. That's the review.
I mean, I think this is a great album. That's not a helpful review. None of these are really helpful reviews. If I was trying to decide if I should buy a Rise by Amebix and I looked on Amazon, this is not helpful. The closest one is maybe the one that comes from the Fathers of Crust Punk. But even that, for that to be of any use, you'd have to already know what crust punk was. And if you know what crust punk is, you've probably already heard a Rise by Amebix.
Yeah, what's really funny about those reviews is I think I also had to cheat by translating that first one into English, but those 2 were the only English reviews for this album on Amazon I could find. So, basically nobody on Amazon talking about this album. That doesn't mean it's not good. It's just that nobody on Amazon is talking about this album.
That's just the type of people that listen to Amebix don't use Amazon because it's evil.
True. And you know what I will say? Amazon discussion does not make a thing good. I think we learned that from Law Abiding Citizen.
Oh my God. That was probably my least favorite review section we've ever done, to be honest.
Hell yeah, dude. I'm so glad I can make that miserable for you. But speaking of things that are miserable, but in a way that's tolerable, let's get into the track listing here. So this first song, The More, this is an all-instrumental track. It's the only instrumental track on the whole album. And I can definitely hear some Mayhem influence on this track for sure. It's very strong to me. Especially on that first album, Death Crush, that's that first album. I definitely hear some instrumentation on this song that I could imagine would be on Death Crush.
Yeah, I know I read a lot of Norwegian black metal bands citing this album as an influence. I wasn't able to find Mayhem specifically saying that. I did see Varg talking about this album, but I feel like that probably was more of an influence on early Burzum.
Yes, of course, as we know, Brian, you and I both know, Varg Vikernes is also somebody with notably very good politics.
I can't think of anyone with more disparate politics than Varg from Burzum and the Baron from Amebix, famed anarchist, anti-Thatcherist. What a cool guy.
All right. And so the next track on here, this is our first non-instrumental track. This is Axeman, which I think, just reading the lyrics, is this literally based on the Axeman of New Orleans? Because it sounds like Axeman of New Orleans.
I mean, there's nothing so specific in it that confirms that for me, but I did the same thing where I thought, I bet this is about the Axeman of New Orleans. It's lock up the doors, the Axeman is coming, and then the chorus is like, he's coming, he's here. Nothing too specific to confirm that, but it must be, right?
No, I mean, it has to be. So, to the audience at home who might not know who the Axeman of New Orleans was, he is an unidentified serial killer who operated in, of course, New Orleans in the late 1910s, around the end of World War One. And his whole thing was, once again, he was never caught. He killed, 5, 6 people or whatever. But one night he put out a letter to the local newspaper and basically said, every jazz lounge or bar that plays jazz tonight, nobody will die. And nobody died that night. So that's how he's most remembered.
And that if he went up to a family's house and heard jazz music playing while he was on the porch, he would leave them alone. And people did. People went out and bought record players and jazz records so they could play jazz to keep the Axeman away. He's my favorite serial killer. I know that's a weird phrase, but he is. Another thing about him is that, at least at the time, people had a hard time figuring out how he got into houses, because some of the houses he went into were locked and showed no signs of forced entry and no struggle around the homes. So the old wives' tale was that he was a spirit that turned into a fog and seeped under doorways. But yeah, I'm sure that this song is about the Axeman of New Orleans. But again, not very specifically. I think it's just a cool, kind of threatening phrase for a cool, threatening riff. This song to me does sound like a slowed down Motorhead. It's probably the bluesiest song on them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So yeah, other than the connection to the Axeman of New Orleans, I didn't really have much to add to it. It's just a solid song.
I think it's a good opener. It is one of, I think, the more memorable tracks of this, maybe because it is the opener. Nowhere near my favorite track, but you get your cool little instrumental, your ambient piece that builds up with the Moors, kind of builds some tension, and you go right into this kind of chugging, pretty metallic song for a punk band in 1985. Again, I'm pretty clear, Motorhead influence here. I think it's a good opener. It's anthemic, although lyrically it's kind of lacking, especially because I think Amoebics actually have much better lyrics than a lot of their contemporaries at other points on this album. But it's just a simple riff-based song with a cool chanty chorus.
No, I will agree. And you know what? Speaking of lyrics that are good for mid-80s punk, this next song here is Fear of God. And I put in my notes, this is the first song that I actually really like. And you know what? Along with its anarchist roots and all that, this is, I would say, a song lyrically that's pretty critical of organized religion in general. That's what it basically sounds like to me. It talks about, fear of God. Your priorities are wrong. Your faith is blind. Crush the weak. Uphold the strong. Burn the brains of mankind. Sounds to me like basically against, could be anything from just regular, dogmatic priest to, could be about televangelists. It could be about a lot of things.
One of the things with Amoebics lyrically, and this is probably a good place to get into it, I do think their lyrics are a little bit more literary than some other 80s punk bands. An interesting thing about them is, if they were an American punk band and they were writing these same lyrics, we'd all be saying they were one of the most political punk bands of the era. Because a lot of US punk at the time is not super political, with the exception of the Dead Kennedys. The hardcore bands in the States, they're not explicitly political. They just hate Reagan generally, and maybe they hate the church generally, but they're more about AIDS. But in the UK, of course, it's the anarcho scene. You've got these very political bands, and they're all writing diatribes. So Crass, who are literally the artists who kind of discovered Amoebics and kind of mentored them, played with them a lot, their lyrics are like these diatribes. They're almost like speeches outlining very specific topics like institutionalized sexual violence or animal cruelty. And in that context, it's kind of funny. Amoebics in the anarcho scene got a reputation as not being very political. It's very funny to me that a band who wrote songs like Fear of God or Spoils of Victory could be looked at by their peers in the anarchist punk scene and seen as the apolitical band. But even though Baron Miller identified, and I think still does, debatable, as an anarchist, his real kind of muse is, so he describes himself as a Gnosticist. He's really into his pagan shit. I guess the idea of Gnosticism is that we are in a struggle to self-affirm because the God that looks over the world is actually malevolent one, right? So our existence in opposition to that and to find our own clarity. So that's the kind of the thread that the Baron is following in his anarchism, rather than how his peers Crass and the Mob were maybe following a more practical and explicit version. And that to me maybe kind of explains some of the developments that Miller Miller took later in life, when you look at that, his kind of anarchism was maybe always a little bit more about something symbolic.
No, absolutely. And also, I kind of wanted to expound upon the idea that you said that a lot of people in the anarcho-punk scene didn't necessarily consider them super political. Verse 3 on this song says, "The money spent on churches could appease the starving poor. To justify injustice, you must misinterpret Christ. You lock your wealth away at night behind a bolted door. The fear of God, you hypocrite, open up your eyes." That's extremely political.
It is. One of the things Amebix is famous and popular for is their anarchist kind of dance. But I don't think it's that people thought they weren't political enough, but it's kind of funny because the way I view it is more that Amebix were writing these really literary songs, whereas I'm going to keep going back to Crass, because Crass are kind of the band the whole anarcho scene is centered around. Write these very literal, very wordy lyrics that are almost like speeches, and they leave like nothing for interpretation. So I think just the fact that Amebix's lyrics were just a little bit more vague and a little bit more like open to interpretation and maybe open to spirituality to their peers made them seem like a less political band. Because again, if an American punk band wrote those lyrics you just wrote, we'd all consider them one of the most political hardcore bands.
That's also very true. And you know what, Brian? I know obviously you mentioned Crass as being the most emblematic of anarcho-punk, but I think the most famous anarcho-punk band, Brian, I think you're forgetting, is Chumbawamba.
Yes, and they're actually affiliated with Crass early on. Glad you brought that up. We won't go too much down the Chumbawamba rabbit hole today. I could talk about this shit all day. I really could. I just got the book The Day the Country Died also. I actually got it in preparation for this episode, even though there's not that much information about any of it specifically. But listeners, Chumbawamba's first couple albums were Nevermind the Ballad. And there's another Chumbawamba record with the title Pictures of Starving Children Sell Records. So next time you think about the Tub Thumper band, just remember that. They started out on a Crass section on the same compilation that Amebix started out on. Yeah, they both debuted it on different volumes of the Bullshit Detector series, which was a compilation that Crass released. Basically, if you sent Crass a tape, no matter how lo-fi it was, if it was like an anarchist punk tape, they'd put you on their compilation album. They put out like 6 of them.
Yeah, honestly, when I first heard about Chumbawamba, because obviously I'd heard the song Tub Thumper a trillion times, and I was like, wait, they were a political band? And I was genuinely blown away by that. So, absolutely based band. Honestly, I think they're a fucking great band.
The Pictures of Starving Children album, that's one of my favorite anarcho-punk albums. Again, that's a good example of how the anarchist punk scene is really the intersection of like avant-garde kind of post-punk tendencies and this more kind of street kind of roots rock thing kind of coming together. Chumbawamba and Amebix probably played together a few times.
Hell yeah. And I think we can all agree that the members of Chumbawamba and Baron Miller would agree about politics completely today.
Oh, probably. I sure hope we don't learn anything horrible about any of them.
All right, so let's get on to track number 4 here. Now, this is obviously the one I mentioned in the trivia. So this is Largactyl, and I mentioned it earlier, but I want to reiterate it. This song fucking is awesome. I love this song.
Yeah. You know, it's between this song and one other one for what my favorite track on the album is, but they're really neck and neck. For me, this might not be my personal favorite on the album, but if I had to show someone one track by Amebix to kind of show them what they're about, it would probably be Largactyl. So I guess what this song is, and for the most part, this will kind of give a good description of the album's overall sound, I hope. The guitars and the synthesizer that mostly doesn't make kind of synth pop noises, but kind of feedback, distorted metal scraping noises. They're kind of just bludgeoning. You got these bludgeoning kind of simple guitar riffs that are not super fast, not typical punk speed. They're more like maybe a mid-tempo Black Sabbath number. He's got these kind of industrial pummeling drums, really simple kind of usually like a 4/4 kind of like mechanical sound. But the bass throughout this album, and anyone that listens to this album, I want you to take a second and listen to what the bass is doing, because it's not super high in the mix, but boy, the Baron is moving all over. Like, you can really tell that he's influenced by Lemmy's bass playing as well as his vocals. And this song really shows that he has these really lyrical and kind of melodic bass lines, and they're kind of smuggled in to this cacophonous guitar noise. That's, I think, overall what most of the album sounds like. The riff Largactyl, I think, is probably the best one, is because it's got a little bit more oomph. So all the songs here we said are like dirges, but this song actually, like, it's catchy, or as catchy as Amebix allow themselves to be. Basically, the chorus is just a chant. You're chanting the words Largactyl, but every time I listen to this, I think, boy, I bet this kicks so much ass live. I bet it's so fun to like scream the lyrics from this along with the guys.
Yeah, no, I absolutely love this song. And I will say, too, even though I think this is a great song, the lyrics on this, while they are great as well, the lyrics on this song are what a Scientologist punk band would make.
I had a similar thought on this. I was like, oh boy, I like the lyrics to this song. I think in the context of knowing about their original drummer and, the way that people with severe mental illness, are treated, I do think it's effective. But I thought that too. I was like, oh boy, I bet a Scientologist would like this. And it's so like, oh, don't trust therapy.
Yeah. But yeah, it's basically a song about, yeah, the old drummer getting institutionalized, basically being turned into a drugged up zombie. And they promise him a comfortable life if he just takes all these drugs or whatever. And it's like, well, are you really that if you're just an overly medicated zombie? Which, to be fair, if he is like a schizophrenic paranoiac, if that's the case, he probably should be medicated.
Maybe, but I want to give a counter to this, which is that, there's a spectrum of schizophrenia. And, I've had someone in my life who in the past I was pretty close to who was diagnosed schizophrenic. And I guess it's possible that maybe, some people have episodes, but maybe they don't need to be drugged up forever. And maybe that, their families or, institutions just fill some people with like this cocktail of drugs to make them into zombies instead of like working with them, I guess. But the other thing I thought, yeah, it's like, well, it's possible if this guy was like life was like consumed by his illness, he might have been better off and happier on that cocktail of drugs. Like I have no way of knowing, obviously.
You're totally right. It doesn't have to be that way, but for some people, it definitely should be that way, unfortunately. And I have no idea, obviously, what to judge this individual's life.
So I think when I know the song's about a specific person who they were friends with, it becomes a little bit more resonant. So upon re-listening to Arise for this show, because I've listened to Amoebics, on and off throughout, my life at different points, but I don't revisit them all the time. They aren't like one of my favorite punk bands. They're not like the Germs or some band that I listen to all the time or the Spits or whatever. So when I re-listened to them for this podcast, well, I was struck by how good a lot of their lyrics are. I do remember one of my thoughts about this song being like, well, these lyrics are a little simplistic.
But yeah, definitely great song. And you know what? Speaking of, I think I know what your favorite song is. So let's get into the fifth track here. Drink and Be Merry. Now, this is a slower track, a little bit gothy. And it's slower at first, but then it obviously changes tempo about halfway through. And I think this might be the best song in the album.
Yeah, I think this is my favorite Amoebics track. And I want to just say, just to give some context maybe, my actual favorite Amoebics records are not Arise. They're the things they did for Spiderleg, their first album and their first EP, which are a little punkier than Arise, maybe a little bit less uniform sounding. But this was the first Amoebics song I ever heard. I mean, it's still my favorite. It's very slow, and most of the time it's quiet. It's very gothy, got some kind of Bauhaus vibes and some Joy Division vibes. And again, I would say a good amount of like Killing Joke in it. And then speaking about Amoebics' lyrics, this is, I think, a really good example of how their lyrics are better than a lot of their contemporary punk bands. This is like, I think, imagistic song. I mean, it's very vague. It's about some sort of decay and some decaying quality of life and the idea that maybe because of war, maybe because of famine, that, we're living in the present. Then, drink and be merry, for tomorrow we may die. I think most people, when I hear people talk about this song, assume that it's about war. I kind of feel like this is more about like economic kind of struggles. Maybe just the sound of it to me, it sounds, very decaying and it's very desperate. There's an interesting lyric in here where the Baron says that the air smells like Dachau. And you're kind of like, okay, that's a really good dark lyric, but I just want to put a little pin in that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, once again, this album was recorded in 1985. So like mid to early 80s UK was not a very positive time in British history. So I can understand some of the cynicism of a lot of these lyrics might come from.
Well, and that's the thing. So I've been listening to a lot of these like second wave British punk bands. And kind of the thing that I think, so when you look at the Sex Pistols, Buzzcocks, The Clash, they're almost like predicting what's about to come with Thatcherism. Maybe not consciously, but that's almost like this last explosion of like 70s kind of artistic energy. All these bands that are kind of art school kids that are, maybe to some degree politically aware, some of them very much so, like The Clash, some of them less, like, the Sex Pistols. But they're basically saying like, oh, the future doesn't look very good. And so we're like railing against that. But this is my favorite track on the album. And it's probably the one where I think the synthesizers are most obviously apparent.
Interestingly enough, Brian, I think that this song has a little bit of like a high fantasy sort of like
Yeah.
nonfiction sort of like, once again, fantastical theme. That's kind of similar to This Is England from the album Cut the Crap by The Clash a little bit.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's interesting because I hadn't thought of that, but I see what you mean because This Is England is one of my favorite songs of all time. That's also got this kind of feeling of like almost like impending apocalypse and a feeling of like failure to like save the world, I guess. Like that's what both of these songs kind of make me think of.
Yes. And also This Is England, Brian, comes from once again the album Cut the Crap. I think you would all agree is the best Clash album.
Oh, clearly. So my real take on Cut the Crap is that even though it's just dog shit, because it has This Is England, I can't hate it. Because that's like a top 5 Clash songs for me.
No, very much so. Absolutely. Yeah, I'm kidding. I think everybody would agree that Cut the Crap is, I would say, pretty much universally considered their worst album.
And the other thing, I guess, talking about Amebix being, influential to metal bands, is that you see that come up lyrically here. Of course, you can see the influence on metal in Ashman and Fear of God, which you've talked about. I also think here you've got the Baron affecting kind of a nerdy, old England, drink and be merry, for tomorrow we shall die. And it's like, okay, what are we at a Ren Fair now, dude?
Well, speaking of Ren Fair, let's get into the next song here, Spoils of Victory. So this is the 6th track. So this one's not as good to me as Drink and Be Merry and Largactyl, but also, once again, a great song. This middle 3 is definitely my favorite series of songs in this album. Like, these middle 3 are all amazing.
I actually think this whole back end of the album is pretty solid. Again, I wouldn't say there's a bad track. It's more like it comes up and down in waves. Spoils of Victory for me is mostly notable because it's got this stellar bass work on it. A lot of it is, to be honest, I don't have much more to say about it that distinguishes it from Largactyl or Fear of God, where it's very kind of crushing riffs. Except for that, there's a lot of really noticeable kind of light-fingered bass work from the Baron here, which is pretty much true throughout the album. Pretty sure this is a Falklands song, but I didn't read the lyrics. Maybe I should have. Any thoughts on the lyrics for Spoils of Victory, Taylor?
Not really, but I can imagine this has something to do with the Falklands, because, the whole anarcho-punk scene definitely was around the time of the Falklands War. Of course, Craft famously made a Falklands War song. So, it could definitely be about that, but I didn't do enough research to tell you quite what the connection might be there.
Amebix, their politics are more vague. Of course, Press do not have vague lyrics. They don't leave any room for doubt. Amebix are more, I think, talking about the vibes. The whole thing with Arise, just the whole album, and maybe the whole band, their politics aren't necessarily Thatcher did this and Reagan did this and it's leading to this and this. It's more like, boy, the vibes in England are bad, huh?
Yeah, these are fucked vibes, exactly. Oh, Jesus Christ. And speaking of fucked vibes, possibly, let's get into the 7th track, Arise. So this is the title track. And I think that this one could be definitely a sequel to Fear of God. There's a little bit of anti-theist lyrics in here. And I described it in the note as this is literally an epic song.
Yeah, it is. This is another contender for my favorite on the album. Another one that I might show someone to show them Amebix. I would end up going with Largactyl because it's shorter and maybe more concise. But for Amebix, this is like a big song. This is a grand song. Of course, the lyrics Arise, getting again into the vague anarchism. Could be about anything. But I would say this is, again, about organized religion.
It's almost like a mission statement, which is weird because it's the 7th track in.
Yeah, that might be why it ended up being the title track. It also is like a summation of the album, I think, which is maybe why it's the long. Well, other than Drink and Be Merry, which is just longer because it's this slow atmospheric song. But I'd have to say, if I think this song is about anything, it's probably about religion, because that seems to be the only thing that Miller wrote about that he protested with any sort of specificity. Of course, he's anti-war and anti-capitalism in the way that all of his anarchist peers were. But sometimes I sort of wonder if at the time he was maybe sort of almost like an internet atheist, like kind of like, an angry guy who mostly was mad about religion because he thought it was like telling him what to do. And that seems to have been the thing that he focused on, which again is maybe why they resonated so much with metal bands. If Amebix had been going off and talking about, the AIDS crisis and animal rights more explicitly, would they have connected with so many like heavy metal bands?
So quick digression though, you talk about the internet Reddit atheists. I think outside of them being kind of annoying, I think these last couple of years of reactionary resurgence have kind of mostly proven them right.
Yeah, no, they absolutely have. The thing that I think is important to remember when criticizing them is I think the guys in that scene that grew up to be bad were going to end up there either way. Like, they didn't end up there because of their atheism. The guys who ended up being anti-Muslim, which is, I would say, I have to assume is a vocal minority of that, like, annoying atheist crowd.
Yes, I agree. You're talking about the reactionary turn. One of the first like notable reactionary like turns of internet atheism was a certain subsection of atheists, which kind of have become like a silent majority to a certain extent, were against the idea of something called atheism plus, which was the idea of including like social justice into atheism.
So if we take the atheist thing at face, you and I are both old millennials, so we have pretty vivid memories of these arguments online, and probably even we're both involved in a few of them.
Oh, I was very involved in these arguments.
Me too. I guess if you're a guy who says, well, I'm an atheist because of logic and science, and that has nothing to do with politics, which, like, is ostensibly true, but I also can't imagine a good reason that you'd need to keep social justice out of your atheism, you know?
Yeah, the idea of just completely ignoring the social justice portion of like being anti-religion in general, or just being an atheist in general, like, I mean, religion has just so much to do with just systemic oppression. So getting rid of the like social justice element, to me, it just doesn't make any sense.
We have gone on a digression, but I like this. So if you're anti-religion because you feel like people shouldn't be able to tell other people what to do because of their religion, doesn't that extend to like what they say about women or what they say about like gay people or whatever? I feel like I'm sounding like very basic, like Daily Show right now, but it's just funny to me that there's a group of people who are saying, well, I'm anti-religion because it's not scientific, but I don't actually care about the problems that it, benefits.
Yeah, I just hate that they're wrong. That's the only thing.
I just like being right. I just like being right. Yeah. I just want everyone to know that I'm right. That's all.
Well, to be fair, you know what? Like, this might have been a digression, but I think it does have a little bit to do with maybe an article we're going to talk about in just a moment.
One of the things I'm kind of working towards with Amoebics and with Baron Rob Miller is, was he an anarchist? Was he affiliated with Crass and in the anarcho-punk scene because he was an anarchist? Or was he sort of an anarchist because he was in that scene and making music around those people? I wonder. Because even early on in like the 90s, I was able to find some quotes by Miller where he seemed a little resentful of Crass. So obviously Miller is like pretty spiritual, which I think is interesting. I'm not opposed to that. But he's kind of talking about how other anarchists dismissed spirituality. And he said, you know what? Even though we all said we were anarchists, Crass kind of dictated what everyone's politics were. And I didn't like that. And he doesn't elaborate that, but you want to be like, well, what didn't you like about it? And that kind of got me thinking, there's a reason we're working on this. Like, was Rob Miller particularly interested in like social justice or in anarchist politics? Because he doesn't write about them very explicitly. He kind of writes about maybe the pagan or Gnostic side of it more than anything else.
Yeah, no, exactly. But save that thought, Brian, because this next song, I think, is a little bit political. So this is the penultimate track in this album, Slave, which is another, once again, good epic song, in my opinion. And the lyrics of this one kind of sound like about environmental degradation and climate change. And that is a political topic.
Yeah, and that's another thing that too, when you get into the anarchists, and there were bands that wrote about it very explicitly. It would make sense to me if Miller was more interested in environmentalism than certain other topics because he is like a pagan or whatever, and they all are like fucking tree huggers or whatever. Slave to me is just a cool song. This track doesn't particularly stand out to me. Don't like it as much as the 4 tracks before it, or even, the 6 tracks before it. Every time I listen to this album, maybe I'm a little peaked by the time I get here, and I'm just like, well, I've had a bunch of good tracks in the even Axeman, I think, is like a better track than this. But again, there's no bad tracks on this album. I don't know if Slave musically hits me too hard. If you like the 6 tracks before it, you'll like this one.
And also, there's one verse on this album that I think is, once again, a mission statement for this whole album. So it's acid rain, rocks on fire, poison clouds, God's a liar. There's nothing left for the meek. The past is gone. The future is bleak. And I'm like, that is Amoebics Arise.
Yep. Well, here's the thing again. I find it really interesting, and I know I said this already. If that was an American punk band in the 80s, we'd all be saying they were the most political band. Then we'd all be saying, oh, they're so uncompromising. But you're kind of like, well, what is this? What is this pussyfooting thing? It's also like, okay, they're kind of talking about environmentalism, and then they say God's a liar. And it's like, well, what does that have to do with it?
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, from the cradle to the grave, you made yourself the system's slaves. Evil systems, government control are to blame for our downfall, which, you know what, I think, once again, the article that we'll get to, maybe, I'm not saying we're getting to an article, he would agree with that statement to this day still.
Well, one of the things, and I think I've said this on the show before, is that if you follow anarchism at its core, in a practical way, I would say that there's only two ways that you can really develop that in practice. This is me being judgmental. And if we had any listeners, our anarchist listeners, who get pissed off at me, which is you either become like a neoliberal, maybe like a left-leaning, like a better neoliberal, or you become like a weird libertarian. I'm not necessarily alluding to anything, but I feel like those are the two natural developments of being an anarchist in practice.
No, absolutely. Anarchism is ostensibly like a left-wing ideology, but the things that, the ideology ultimately leads to, I would not describe as particularly leftist. I'll just say that.
Well, and here's the thing, we're never going to get to post-capitalism in the West at this point. I'm sorry to say it.
No.
I just do not see any evidence of it. So at this point, anyone that I know, who identifies as an anarchist is my friend. I would say we generally have similar enough values and worldviews that I'm not going to be like, oh, I don't agree with you because you're an anarchist and I'm a socialist, because it does not fucking matter, because we're not going to get to either of those places. But I would say in the hypothetical that will never happen, where we reached post-capitalism and we had to choose between like a socialized state or like an anarchist non-state, like anarchists would end up being like libertarians in practice.
Would totally agree with that 100%. All right, so let's get on to the last track in this album. So this is The Darkest Hour, and the notes I have here is, and I mentioned this to you, and I don't think you quite got it at first until I mentioned it, was the opening riff sounds like Schism by Tool, so I thought that was pretty funny. And this song is kind of about essentially burying who may be our possible protagonist in this story.
This is not my favorite track on this album, but I really like this as a closer. This is, I would say, right after Drink and Be Merry, the most post-punk kind of gothy track on here.
We'll agree with that, yes.
This to me feels like a coda. Like I would say Arise and Slave are like the real like climaxes kind of this album. And this is kind of like the lingering like feeling of it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this is a great song to end the album. Like, solid, once again, 38 minutes and 20 seconds of songs. Like, let's end this over half an hour of epic fucking songs on this fairly slow track in comparison to a lot of the other songs. But yeah, great fucking song. Honestly, Brian, I'm glad you recommended this album for the podcast, because I didn't even know this band existed until you had us fucking listen to it for the show.
I thought you'd like this album, given that it's on the more metallic side of punk, and it influenced a lot of music that I know you love.
I love, obviously, black metal. I'm not, I'll be honest, a gigantic, I don't know a whole lot about Venom, but I love black metal, the album Black Metal, and I love Sepultura. They're still one of my favorite metal bands, even though I'm not, once again, the biggest fan of their early stuff, but I still like the early stuff.
So this album does include, I've listened both ending it for the last couple of weeks, listening to this in preparation for the show. I ended my listening on Darkest Hour. I also listened to the reissue, which includes 2 bonus tracks. They're fine. Kind of does the album a disservice to have 2 tracks after Darkest Hour, because that's so clearly the ending point for the record. The bonus tracks are called Right to Ride and Beyond the Sun. They're both about 6 minutes long, so pretty long. They're actually kind of jammy. Not jammy, but kind of groovy. They're biker songs. Another aspect of Amoebics that maybe you don't pick up on this album is that they're kind of a biker band.
Now, to be fair, when you say biker, you mean like Neil Armstrong bikers, right? Like they do the Tour de France?
Yes, they're in tiny little shorts.
But yeah, so I was actually thinking about doing that, but I actually had the same thought, because I'm just like, well, it doesn't really fit to add more songs after this, because this is, very clearly the last song on this album. Maybe if they had mixed those 2 songs in there, like in the middle somewhere, it might have made more sense. But yeah, I mean, it doesn't really make much sense. It kind of reminds me of, and this is totally off topic, but in the original filming of the movie The Room, the Tommy Wiseau movie, I know I always mention it, but during the filming, when Tommy Wiseau kills himself, he got up after that scene to be like, oh no, Lisa, after he killed himself. It's like, that's not how that works. You can't do that.
Yeah, no, you're dead. Bonus tracks are fine, but it does kind of feel like they needed bonus tracks for the reissue to get people to buy it who already had it. I mean, they're good songs. They don't really add to the narrative of the album. But yeah, a very important album to the development of punk and metal. Very much made it a moment of time in the UK by ostensibly leftists. It's a very bleak album, which, I know this is a vague thing to say, but it does make it feel very relevant to me now. So this album to me sounds like economic decay and famine. That's what this album makes me think of. It's one of the bleakest rock albums I've ever heard.
And you know what? Speaking of, as I mentioned earlier, that's definitely what 80s UK, a lot of people probably felt like was going to happen. And to be fair, they weren't necessarily that far off.
I did just want to go through a little bit of a timeline for Amebix, and that should lead us right into our next segment, I think. So Amebix formed in 1978. The three-piece, including our hero, Baron Rob Miller. Self-released a demo in 78 or early 79, I forget which I love, but it sounds like shit. It's shit. It's trash. It's recorded on a tape. It's unmixed. They recorded it live. Bass guitar, drums. What stands out to me about this demo, which is just called Amebix, is that it sounds very influenced by early Public Image Limited. It's got these kind of almost funky punk bass lines and jerky rhythms, and then these very atonal lead guitars. Very influenced by early post-punk, much more, I would say, than later. Not really metallic the way that Amebix are known for being. A track from that tape is what's chosen by the band Crass to go on their first compilation, the first volume of their Bullshit Detector compilation series. From there, they pretty quickly develop into a 5-piece band. They add another guitarist and a synth player. Synth's pretty weird in punk at the time, but not so weird in the anarchist scene, which, as I'd say, pretty open to post-punk and avant-garde influences. But most of the synths that are going on in Amebix at this point, they're not so much, melodic. They're more like these scraping metallic, industrial, like throbbing gristle-esque noises. They more just add to the layers of noise that the guitars are doing. They release Who's the Enemy and No Sanctuary, their EP and their first full-length, both on Spiderleg Records. These two releases are probably my personal favorites by Amebix. Even though Arise is where you should start, that's like the defining piece. I would say that the Spiderleg records, which have been collected in a single CD, if you're interested, they're mixed a little bit more to my liking. They're also still a little bit heavier on the post-punk influence, still pretty heavy. Also, I think at this point, Baron's vocals are a little bit, maybe because they're a little bit punkier and a little bit less of a Lemmy thing, they're maybe a little more accessible to me. Because I'm going to be honest, his vocals from Arise onward sound a little cartoonish to me.
Yeah. A lot of 80s punk, though. Like, a lot of it just sounds like the drunk guy at the local pub who is just a little too enthusiastic.
Yeah, and Anarcho especially sounds like that. It's really funny when you listen to a band like Fucks of Pink Indians or Zounds or Crass. Clearly these very intelligent bands, with these very wordy lyrics, and it's just like, blah, 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 like this like drunk Cockney guy raving to you about Thatcher. Of course, after No Sanctuary and Who's the Enemy, which again, start with Arise, but if you like that, talking to you, Taylor. You should listen to the Spiderleg recordings. They're really cool, and it's probably my personal favorite stuff by them. Jello Biafra of the Dead Kennedys says he wants to put out a record for them. He does put out Arise. The band is hugely influential. Nothing else really sounds like it in punk at the time. I feel like here they really perfect their brew of, like I said, it's this cross between Motorhead and Killing Joke, and it really stands out. There isn't a whole lot of cross-pollination between punk and metal at this time, and the stuff that is kind of the punk metal hybrids that do exist do not sound like this. It's a very bleak, intense album, and it does, I would say, pave the way for early extreme metal. Black metal probably would not exist the way it did if not for this album. This was such a direct influence on so much of the Norwegian bands. From there, they put out Monolith in 87. I've only listened to that a couple times in my life, to be honest. For me, it's kind of just a more refined version of Arise. Again, if you like Arise, you'll like Monolith. Amebix break up shortly after. They go on a long hiatus. And in 2011, Amebix reunite. They put out a record called Sonic Mass. Did you read about Sonic Mass at all?
I did no research other than this album.
Okay, so that's good. I'm going to tell you something. They do a reunion on Sonic Mass. So the drummer for that album is a guy named, you might know this name better than I do, Roy Mayorga? Do you know who that is, Taylor?
Yes, I do believe he was in Soulfly or Sepultura.
So I know that he was in Stone Sour.
He was in Stone Sour. He was in Stone Sour. Yep, that too.
The drummer for fucking Stone Sour became a member of Amebix. Now, how fucked is that? I'd never listened to it before. In preparation, I did listen to Sonic Mass twice. Gonna give you my thoughts on it real quick, okay? So, Rob Miller, the Baron himself, said for years, in a lot of punk bands from the 80s, we never liked how our records sounded. We didn't like how poor the production was. It's just all we could afford. They always say, I wish they could have sounded better. I wish we'd played better. Well, in 2011, Stig and the Baron make a new Amebix record, and it has Pro Tools. It's very high production values. shows. It sounds like bad metalcore. And that's not a joke. Sonic Mass sounds like metalcore, but with the Baron's blah, blah, vocals on it. Not very good. What's more interesting, Taylor, is the single for Sonic Mass, which was called Knights of the Black Sun. That's Black Sun, S-U-N. After that album, Amoebix is done. They put out the album, they play some shows, they announced their retirement. Fine. If you want to do one more album, and I don't think it's very good, but do your last album, and it. So the Baron starts a new band called Tau Cross. I did not listen to Tau Cross at all. I'm assuming it sounds similar to Sonic Mass. And also I looked at his collaborators for it, and I just was not that interested. Taylor, did you read anything about Tau Cross?
I did not, but Brian, you gave something for me to read. You mentioned collaborators. I think, Baron might have another collaborator that he's a big fan of, if you know what I mean. So Let's get into this article. This article, Brian, that you sent me is from Brooklyn Vegan, and the title of this article is Tau Cross's Rob Miller doubles down, defends his support of Holocaust denier Gerard Menuhin. So, got to the Holocaust, finally.
Well, he was really working there. Clearly a lot of allusions to it in Amoebix. An Amoebix album cover actually has a photo of the aftermath of a concentration camp. I believe that's on No Sanctuary.
Lovely. We obviously mentioned the Dachau connection from earlier in the lyrics. This is a thing that he is very notably passionate about. I'll just say that.
Yeah, and the thing is that I think pretty clearly at the time in the anarchist scene, you'd read that as that's a critical thing. He's saying pretty obviously in Drink and Be Merry, the air smelling of Dachau means it smells like death, and that's bad. But where are we now?
He might enjoy the stench of it, or he might not think the stench exists. Anyways, let's get into the body of this article here. So, Tau Cross, featuring frontman Rob Miller of Amoebix, as well as members of Voivod, Misery, and Provoked, were dropped by Relapse Records just 1 month after announcing their third album for the label. After the label discovered that Miller thanked noted Holocaust denier Gerard Menuhin, whose 2015 book Tell the Truth and Shame the Devil calls the Holocaust the, quote, biggest lie in history, unquote, in the liner notes for the album. Miller thanked Menuhin for, quote, for the inspiration and material behind the ideas represented on this album, unquote, and also for, quote, for taking me down a very dark road that has led me to unexpected illumination, unquote. The 4 other members of Tau Cross then responded with their own statements, saying none of them were familiar with Menuhin and that they are, quote, adamantly against anything relating to this kind of ugliness, unquote. We've been vigilant in our attempts to get answers as to why this has happened, and frankly, how could it possibly happen considering our backgrounds and beliefs? So, Tau Cross's Facebook profile has now been pulled, but the PRP reports that before the page was taken down, Miller posted another statement doubling down on his decision to support Gerard Menuhin and later defending his work. Canadian metal blog Boulevard Brutal also posted screenshots. The statement reads, and this is a fairly long statement, but once again, hold on to your butts. And this is an actually long statement, unlike that Amazon review I mentioned earlier, but...
This is important, for real.
Exactly. So the statement says, I would like to second the sentiments of the other members of Tau Cross. I do owe them an apology for not explaining my lines of inquiry for the people who have influenced my views so dramatically over the past few years. They are not in any way to blame for anything I've written or read, and I understand the need to distance themselves from that subject. I wish them all the very best in their futures and treasure the times we have shared together. The book, Tell the Truth and Shame the Devil by Gerard Menuhin is available on Amazon and Kindle. We should do Amazon reviews for that. No, let's not do that. Also in Goodreads, where it gets consistent 4.5 out of 5. So not exactly obscure or unavailable. Unless you live in Germany, where it is forbidden to engage in any conversation on some of the matters contained within those pages. I wonder why.
Weird.
Yeah, very interesting. There are a number of people languishing in prisons over their expressing even a slight academic interest in the matter. So effectively, well, actually, okay, to give a little bit of credit, in many European countries, of course, in Germany specifically, although in many European countries, and also I believe in other non-European countries, such as Israel, and I believe even Australia, I think recently did Holocaust denial as a jailable offense. There are people who have been sentenced to prison for denying the Holocaust publicly. And for the most part, I do disagree with a certain amount of leftists. I am mostly a free speech absolutist, and I do think putting people in prison over stuff like this is a little ridiculous. But like, if you're in Germany or something, I can understand why you might want to stamp down on that shit as much as possible.
Yeah, we're on the same page on that. I'm very much a free speech absolutist. I think, though, there's a type of punk guy, particularly an old school punk guy, who sort of, maybe we should finish this statement and then I'll.
Oh, yes, agreed. So getting back to the article here. So effectively, all discussion is shut down and we live in a state of what can only be described as religious obedience. It is a religion, and anyone approaching the matter is in danger of being charged with heresy and publicly executed. So you can feel free to examine yourself and see if you believe this is a good thing or not. Well, actually, to be fair, in the regime that he's uplifting, you would be publicly executed for things that are far less serious than that.
Yeah, and he knows that. Like, he must know that, given what he's written about in the past and what the views he's expressed in the not that distant past, you know?
Yes. So, and just a quick digression here. So, in Nazi Germany, there was the White Rose Society, which was a group of young college students and even high school students in what would be in America, high school students, who did very basic anti-Nazi resistance. I'm talking about putting posters up, essentially. And the Nazi government literally sentenced like a 14-year-old girl to be publicly beheaded by guillotine.
Yeah, no, they would have killed all of the members of Amoebics.
So, like, I understand you want to be a free speech absolutist to the extent that you're literally going to stick up for the fucking Nazis. But let's not pretend that there's any legitimate academic discussion on whether the Holocaust happened. It 100% happened. There's no debate on that at all.
That's the thing. You know, I'm a free speech absolutist in that way. I'm like that about fucking reactionary politics and even like hateful opinions, you know, the reason I believe in, you know, I hate the phrase deplatforming, but I believe in that and I believe in countering bad opinions. The thing is that Miller isn't being a free speech absolutist. He's decided in his late middle age, and by the way, he retired from MBX to go and basically to be a welder and make swords and ride around on his motorcycle. Pretty cool way to retire if you're an anarchist punk. You know, basically just removed myself from politics and lived in a fucking castle and made swords. I'm pretty sure that he started his musical career up again because he was reading all of this stuff, and that's what inspired him.
Fucking yikes, man. All right, but I will obviously mention other things, but I just want to finish this because this is very interesting. As a singer in a band, I have always been serious about the truth, trying to refine the material and ideas to some kind of overarching theory. I cannot simply skim the material. I have to go into it and prepare to be changed by that journey. That has happened on a number of occasions. Through reading Menuhin's book, through John Lash and his work, through 9/11 research. I wonder what his opinions on 9/11 are.
9/11 research. What a fucking phrase.
Yeah. Through the Europa, the Last Battle video series that is constantly popping up and being pushed back down on YouTube.
He's watching Europa.
Also, by the way, when 9/11 research, I would bet money that he watched Loose Change, and that's what gave him 9/11 research, like enough material.
The dumbest fucking questions you could ask about 9/11, because they're legitimate questions I think about 9/11, like there are.
Oh, for sure.
But not the ones that guys like this are asking. And I just want to say, when he says 9/11 research and you think, well, that's no good. And then he says, and also I've been watching this series, Europa, on YouTube, which is like straight up like a Nazi documentary.
Oh, is it really? Ooh, I was not familiar with that.
It's about how Europe was at one point unified, and that's where the wellspring of all civilization comes from.
I think looking at any history textbook would disagree with that notion entirely. There was never a time and period where Europe was unified on anything.
Yeah, it's so funny. He opens up by saying, I agree with all of the members of Tower Cross. What he's saying is, I agree that the band should break up, I guess. He's trying to be diplomatic, and he's also kind of insulting them. He's going, hey, I understand why you have to distance yourself from me, because it's so scary to say the things I'm saying, and you're not as brave as I am to say it. Like, what an asshole.
Yeah, God. And also, talk about loose change. You know what, Jess, if you're ever listening to our podcast, please release our review of Loose Change, because we have recorded that as an episode, but it's unreleased. Please release that. I want to listen to it.
Man, we can do Loose Change.
We'll do that for 9/11 anniversary episode.
Ooh.
All right, so continuing on this article, if I stop asking questions, I stop being true to myself, so I have no choice. For 99% of people, they have already made up their mind about me based on the words of another man written in a book they have never read, and that is enough to make a judgment. So on you go. Join in the feeding frenzy of virtue signaling and outrage if you like, but I stand by my endorsement of this book as it was such an important part of the journey. This is not to say that I like the author as a person or even know that much more about him. The book is primarily a collection of quotes and original source materials, a book to study and not for salacious gossip. Others will see what is real in this situation and what is not. Messengers of Deception is probably our best album to date. I believe he's talking about the current album for Tau Cross. It continues the inquiry and refines it through the lens of the Gnostic heresy and what that really was, why it had to be completely eradicated, and what that means for our world today. The irony of having released a single about the Inquisition and the suppression of speech should not be lost on anyone. Love and light to all who want it. Rob Miller, Tau Cross, over and out. Now, the update also says, Miller says that Michael Langevin, also Voivod, and Andy Lefton are no longer in Tau Cross and that he will continue the band on his own. Like another very famous metal luminary, Varg Vikernes once again. So this guy has a lot in common with Varg.
Yeah, and again, Arise was an influence on Bard. So it's funny that it comes full circle that way. So this is really what, to me, made this Millennials Are Old content. You got this guy who's in one of the preeminent, explicitly anarchist rock bands. I'm going to say not quite to the degree of Craft. The reason you see Amoebix fucking patches on fucking vests at any metal or punk show you go to, and Taylor, next time you're at a metal show and you're looking at fucking battle vests, keep your eyes peeled. I bet you'll see a couple of the Remix ones. They are a patch band. Probably led to some degree to a lot of people's radicalization towards, some sort of leftism or anarchism or whatever, is, a Holocaust denier. And what's interesting to me about that is how there's this type of person who that's their path. That's like the natural progression for that kind of. And it's like, they're not like a dumb person. They're like average, but they think they're really smart. Or maybe they even are a little bit smarter than average. And their default, their whole life is whatever people say is bad, I'm for. And you're like an anarchist and you're into punk rock. He says, I have to keep questioning things. I have to keep learning things. What that really seems to mean is he has to keep finding weird things to argue about until eventually the only people that he can argue with are people who believe in the Holocaust. And it's like he feels like this is such a universal type of like middle-aged punk rock. Well, if everyone's saying I'm wrong, there must be something to what I'm saying. So they have to double down on it. This obviously sucks for everyone that was in Tau Cross. They put out 3 albums with him. And like I said, I'm pretty sure he was writing about this shit with Tau Cross. That's kind of why I wanted to point out that the single for Sonic Math, the last Amoebix record, was called Knights of the Black Sun. We're all familiar with Black Sun iconography, I think. Kind of an esoteric Nazi symbol. I think Goring had it inscribed on the floor in his office. But yeah, the Black Sun is a more famous Nazi symbol that a lot of people use instead of the swastika.
Oh, is that like the Sonorond or whatever?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, I know what you're talking about. I knew it from the non-English word for it, so yeah.
I couldn't remember what it was, and I didn't want to mispronounce it.
But yeah, no, I do want to mention something about, obviously, his whole thing at this point is about being a Holocaust denier. And in general, I'm actually not against debating almost any topic. Like, I think that there is something to be had about debates about almost any topic that I can think of. But one that there's no argumentation about the Holocaust. And to all our audiences out there who may have some questions about the Holocaust or whatever, I'm joking, obviously, but like the Holocaust is one of the most well-documented human travesties of all time and definitely of the modern age. No question about it. In fact, not only did the Nazis do incredible documentation, the reason we know how many people died is because they kept intimate records about basically everybody who died in the Holocaust. So we have that. We obviously have eyewitness records. We have like footage of the liberation of like concentration camps. We have genetic research and like all these buildings still existing. There's no question that it happened. I don't want to hear any fucking debate about it.
Yeah, there's no reason to have this debate unless, there are 2 reasons, and neither of them are that you don't believe it happened. I really don't think hardly anyone disbelieves the Holocaust happened. There are people who are actively trying to minimize it and what it was, and there are people who feel like they want to argue and they want to be right about something. And so they kind of hype themselves up about it. And they're ultimately doing the same thing. Like you said, I believe you can have a debate about almost anything. I don't necessarily think it's useful, but yeah, you can. There's nuances to most things. I believe there's legitimate things to most conspiracy theories. The thing with the Holocaust is the only reason to deny it, because we know it happened. Every fucking one knows it happened. The only reason is to like downplay that. And the thing is, I think Miller is a lot like a lot of people, kind of like the people who maybe start on the anarchist or even like maybe the socialist path, and they kind of weasel through to libertarian ways, to these far right ways of thinking. He might not think of that as the primary thing that he's taking away from this book, you know? But it's kind of like, how did you end up here? Like, I guess when you look at his statement, there is nothing else he specifically talks about. The only thing that he even alludes to that's a specific thing is the Holocaust, when he says you can't even approach it from an academic subject. So it's not like there's all these other things that this guy was writing about that he was interested in.
No, exactly. And we talk about academic discussion. The only academic subject about the Holocaust is literally what led to it and what was the aftermath of it. That's it. There's no other academic discussion. You can't just be like, well, and to be fair, I was literally going to make a joke, but this is true. I mean, there's a million kinds of people who are historical revisionists on the Holocaust. So it goes for everybody from Rob Miller, who is essentially like a crypto-Nazi from the sounds of it, all the way to people like fucking Benjamin Netanyahu and like other like far-right Zionists. They're also Holocaust revisionists. Like, you know, on the Benjamin Netanyahu side, another like far-right Zionists, it's about saying the Palestinians did the Holocaust and were like the inspiration for Hitler, which is just as fucking stupid as what Rob Miller believes.
Absolutely not.
The Grand Mufti of Palestine or whatever told Hitler to do the Holocaust. Like, insane.
And like, no reason to believe that except for that you want that to be true.
Exactly. You're trying to push an agenda. And that's what this fucking guy does. That's what far-right Zionists do. And it's disgusting, and we need to call it out whenever the fuck it happens.
Well, and in Miller's case, it's kind of like, what did he get bored? Was the thing that he was an anarchist and that was edgy and that got him into fights? And then he sort of just aged into this respected guy in a punk metal community. And probably, especially as he got older, even people that weren't anarchists were like, hey, it's the Amoebics guy. That's cool. And then he was like, oh, I gotta fucking argue with people again.
Yeah, you know what? Like, obviously, punk contrarianism can be annoying, but I would rather have fucking Henry Rollins self-help, like, genuinely does good things kind of contrarianism versus this horse shit.
Yeah, this is just a fucking waste of time. And it's demeaning to every person he's played with that didn't know he had these vows, or the people that played with him when he didn't have these vows. So one of the things I find interesting about when we talk about how Amoebics' political lyrics can be kind of vague and they only really talk about religion, one of the things I wonder is maybe he was never that interested in some of the other anarcho-punk things. Maybe he wasn't that interested in feminism or animal rights or, you know, racism and some of the other things that the other bands in that scene talked about. And maybe that's why they don't come up. But I have no way of knowing that, so I'm not going to go there. For now, I'm going to assume that he had good values at one point and they changed once he got older. But the other thing is, this changes for a lot of people. This changes Amoebics. Not for me. I don't really value music in that way, I don't think. But I think that for people that maybe associate Amoebics with something positive and with a positive scene, this now, for a lot of people, is going to change that band because we don't know now. Like, was he always like that? It's the same as like the Morrissey thing now. And with Morrissey, it's on a bigger scale. Who connect with him and feel understood by him. And now you have to wonder, like, oh, did this songwriter who I felt almost an intimate connection, which of course was parasocial, but still, you know, meaningful to people. Like, were they ever the person I thought they were? Because also what he's saying is so dumb. Like, it's so boring. It's so stupid. And he thinks it's so provocative, but it's so fucking dumb. And again, it's dumb because it's hateful, but even more than that, it's dumb because we know that that shit happened. There's no argument to be made. You're just being this old, isolated, dumb piece of shit who says whatever because you just think if you get a reaction that means you must be saying something good. Really interested to see if any of his old friends in Rudimentary Penny or Crass or any of the anarcho-punk bands around him have, you know, said anything about this. I should have looked into that.
Well, you know, if we ever do a sequel to this album, we could definitely fucking get into it because I would love to cover some more of their material, even if, you know, obviously their 2011 album isn't very good from the sounds of it.
I was thinking about that. I think just because you like this so much, I was thinking maybe we would. I might in the future want to review one of the bullshit detector compilations so you can hear the first Amoebics material and some other anarcho-punk stuff just because it's such a weird scene.
No, hell yeah, dude, 100%. But yeah, so speaking of obviously listening to other things, I'm going to start listening to my fan before I go to sleep because I'm tired and I'm an old ass millennial. So do we have any thoughts before we sign off in this episode here, Brian?
Amoebics Rise is a great album. Great place to start with one of the bleakest rock and roll albums I've ever heard. Really great intersection of kind of post-punk, goth rock, and proto-extreme metal stuff. Ostensibly anarchist, but frontman Rob Miller is a real piece of shit and a real dumb guy.
Yes, and I will agree with that. Just like some of my favorite bands and albums of all time. Love the music, hate the politics of the group or individual at a certain point.
Hate the sin, love the sinner.
All right, so let's get to our plugs here. So you can follow me at Carlos Chantor on Twitter/X.com. I don't have any other social media I'd like to plug, but I would like to plug our Spotify account. So if anybody wants to listen to the audio of our podcast, not on YouTube, you can listen to us on Spotify.com. Millennials Are Old podcast, and you have to spell it completely correctly, otherwise it will not give you our podcast.
Yeah, that's my only plug this week. Shows up on Spotify now. It's going to be much easier for us to promote, much easier for you guys to listen to if you want. Check it out. I'm really excited to have it all on there. And it should be up now, I think, just at the rate as the YouTube show, right?
Yes, at this point, I'm going to have everything uploaded to both YouTube and Spotify. One of these days, as of recording, because maybe I'll fix it as of recording, but I will figure out the RSS feed at a certain point. So I'm going to plan on spreading it to like Google Podcasts and SoundCloud, etc. At some point, I will figure that out. But at least for right now, you can follow us on YouTube and Spotify specifically.
I'm very excited that it's on Spotify. I don't know why, but that's very cool to me.
No, I think it's fucking great too, because like, you're right. Not everybody wants to or even can listen to a YouTube podcast, because to even listen to a podcast without your phone or laptop, computer being on, it's really fucking annoying. Whereas on Spotify, you can at least turn your phone off and listen to it, but you can't do that on YouTube.
Well, you can if you have YouTube Red, but nobody has that shit. It's a fucking waste of money.
Yeah, nobody pays for RedTube. Are you kidding? No. But yeah, so once again, follow us there, and also follow us on future social media or I should say follow us on other podcast platforms, because I will figure that out eventually. I promise.
Awesome. I think we have some cool stuff in the works. Me and Taylor have been talking about some cool things upcoming. Cool stuff coming out. Don't follow me on social media. I'm not on any of it anymore. Twitter eventually.
All right, excellent. And so with no plugs on your end, let's sign off here. Have a good night, everyone.